name, which is Seven. Definitely most people know me as Seven, but my family calls me Zach, and church is family. So you're all more than welcome to call me Zach or Seven. Doesn't matter to me. Call me whichever makes you comfortable. My wife and I, Mariah is my wife. We've been coming here for about 4 years now, almost 4 years. We've loved it. First time we walked in the doors, we left, and she said, that felt like home. And I said, well, this is probably our church. We still shopped around, I'll be honest. We shopped around a little bit. We moved to Rio Rancho at that time, so we wanted to be plugged into a church that was local, because we didn't want our kids to have the excuse that church is too far. That was the whole reason behind it. And so we shopped around a little bit, but every time we came back, we would get in the car after service, so that just feels like home. So we've loved being a part of this church. I've been with T-Mobile for almost 12 years. It'll be 12 years in a couple months now. I've really enjoyed 4 months of it. It's been great. I moved into a new position in April, so 7 months. I moved into a new position in April that I've really enjoyed. So yeah, 7 months of those 12 years have been fantastic. I'm a senior trainer at T-Mobile, but my expertise is in project management. So I am a project management expert for the company. That means I oversee a lot of projects within our training team. I also am the AI expert for our site. So I work with AI integration and education. Myself and my peer, who's also a senior trainer at our call center, we're the two AI education experts for the city of Albuquerque for T-Mobile. So that's been a really fun journey for me. I've enjoyed that. But 8 years ago, I was a preacher, so I better get into it because we can go long. I'm very honored to be sharing my testimony with all of you. A few of you, handful of you have heard this before, but I'll go a little bit more in depth. I gave my life to Christ. I remember it in Sunday school. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and Sherry Missionary. She was a missionary that was a full-time missionary in South America, and she would come and visit our church from time to time, and she would always serve as a Sunday school teacher when she did. And I remember that Sunday, she had us all sit in a circle, and she led us through the sinner's prayer. And afterwards, she pulled me aside, she looked at me, and she said, "You are called into ministry." And I remember I told my dad about that after that. I don't know what that means. But I was called into ministry. That was the first time I ever heard that. I was called. And from that point on, I wore that like a badge of honor. And in fact, I think I used that as a lens for everything from that point on. I was called. About that same time, I got really into writing. I don't think my family really enjoyed it because I would spend hours at the family computer. You know, it was back when every family only had one in the basement. And I would spend hours on that computer writing the same story. It took me like 3 months to get to 5 pages, I think, and the whole family had to reread it every Thursday. I think I made the whole family read the update to the story. But by middle school, I was convinced this is my calling. God called me to be a writer, and that's what I'm going to be. Despite people saying you should probably have a job that pays, right? Everyone else is going to be a nurse or a doctor, at least be a mechanic, right? Get a job that pays money. I said, no. I was called. You think you know, but I was called. And that's what I kept thinking to myself. The truth is, I wasn't pursuing writing, I was pursuing validation. That's what I wanted. I wanted to validate my calling. I believed that my worth was tied to what I could produce. My focus was not on God's purpose for me, but on fulfilling what I thought was my calling. Proverbs 19:21 reminds us, "Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand." Then came high school. In high school, I wanted an easy A class, so I signed up for acting. Turned out I loved acting. I enjoyed, I was in a couple plays in middle school, I enjoyed it, but in high school, I discovered, oh, this is my calling. This is it. I'm going to be an actor. Acting is where God wanted to be. After all, why would he give me a passion and a talent for it if this wasn't my calling? My senior year, I was given a full ride scholarship to UNM on an academic scholarship. Full ride. Everything was paid. Room and board, books, food. And I was very wise at 17-year-old, so I said, there's no way that's God provision. That can't be a God thing, because that looks good, but I was called to act it. Right? Despite many wise people in my life saying, hey, it looks like God might have called you to that. No, I know better. I was called. So I turned that down, and I moved to Hollywood. And I studied at an acting school for a year. And I thought, hey, I could even be a screenwriter. This is perfect. All my callings are coming together. Looking back, I know I was confusing passion with purpose. And that's something I had to figure out. I believe God's calling was something I had to achieve. It was something I thought I needed to figure this out on my own. I needed to figure out how to make my calling work within my passions. So while I was in Hollywood, at my wise 18 years of age, I got engaged for the first time. A little bit of foreshadowing there. I was 18. The relationship I was in was a mess. It was codependent, immature, deeply unhealthy. But I knew God had called me to marry a beautiful woman, and she was there, so it must be her. That engagement ended when I moved back from Hollywood, but the pattern continued. I pursued relationships believing that each one had to be the one because I was called. Each breakup left me more disillusioned, more unsure of myself, and more distant from God. After my first engagement ended, I spiraled hard. I had moved back from Hollywood. I threw myself into partying. My roommates and I would throw these sorry, Dad, I was renting the house from him. We would throw these absolute ragers at our house. I became known across the city of Albuquerque as Party Boy Zach. I would show up at random places on the other side of town, and people would say, "You're Party Boy Zach," and no, I don't know who that is. I got one of those faces. But even in rebellion, God's call never left me. One night during one of those parties, I was in the backyard. A couple of the guys were having a conversation, and somehow I found myself leading a group of 10 people in prayer in the middle of a house party in my backyard. And I didn't recognize it then, but that was a turning point in my life. A few weeks later, I returned to a church, and in a worship service a couple weeks after that, the Spirit of the Lord came on me. I was in tears, and a spirit of suicidal depression that had been with me for 8 years left me. Wow. Yeah. That was when I realized I wasn't called because I was worthy. I was called because God is faithful. Yes. I had forgotten that I was called, but I was called. Romans 11:29 reminds us, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. A few years later, I became a youth pastor at that same church. And I so badly wanted to shed my own identity that in between that time, when I was 21, I stopped going by my first name. I started going by my middle name, Seven. A lot of people had already been calling me Seven. I thought, this is a good time. I don't want to be Party Boy Zach. Let's just go all in. Everyone's going to start calling me this. And for a while, I felt like I was actually finally living out my calling. And then I met a girl. And you know what? So what if she had never been to church before meeting me? Last girl hadn't either. That worked out fine. But we got engaged. In fact, we got married. I was called, right? Then my marriage fell apart. I did everything that I knew was right. I went to counseling by myself when she refused to go with me. I attended a marriage group by myself for months, despite the embarrassment, because I was trying to do what I knew to do. I prayed. I did every chore in that house, made breakfast, lunch, and dinner, cleaned the house every day. I wrote words of appreciation all over the walls, everything I could to try to make her feel loved. And then one day I came home from work, and she had moved to another state to be with her ex. And I could have fallen into despair. I wanted to be bitter and angry, but I was called to be faithful. God used that valley to teach me that my calling wasn't tied to a role. It wasn't tied to a relationship. It was tied to Him. After my divorce, I had to step down from being a youth pastor. I couldn't help but think, but I was called. How am I going to do ministry if I'm not in the ministry? And God began to show me a very simple truth that my dad had been teaching me for years. I just never listened. I wasn't called to a title. I was called to minister to the lost. Wherever I was. I didn't want to be working in the corporate world full time, but I was called. In the years since, I have led, in fact, the first year after that, I led more people to Christ than my entire time as a youth pastor. And that has happened every year since. I've seen God use me in ways I never expected, all because I surrendered my plans for His. And one of the greatest joys in my life was seeing one of my students from that youth ministry take over as the youth pastor in that church. Looking back, I can see the thread of God's faithfulness woven through every chapter of my life. When I tried to force my calling, God gently redirected me, sometimes not too gently. When I thought I had failed, He reminded me that His grace is sufficient. Because the truth is, we are all called. Maybe not to a career or a role, but to a surrender. We are all called to live lives that say, not my will, but yours be done. Today, I am 6 years into a marriage that is so much better than I ever could have dreamed. My wife and I have 2 boys and another boy on the way. Yep. Last year, we had the honor of doing premarital counseling for a couple, and I was asked to officiate their wedding. It was a very meaningful moment for my life, seeing what God took me through to where He brought me. I work as a senior trainer at one of the most liberal companies in the United States of America, and I share my testimony and the gospel with hundreds of people every single year. I never imagined this is where I would be in my 30s. I didn't look at my 30s and say, yep, I'll be on my second marriage climbing a corporate ladder. That sounds right. But I was called. Romans 8:28 reminds us, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. And Micah 6:8 comes with a challenge. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you except to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? So I'll leave you with this question. What do you need to surrender to God's call today? What expectations or what burdens is He asking you to lay down so that He can work in your life? Because no matter where you have been or what you have done or what situation you are in, one thing is true for each of us, but you were called. Thank you. That's good.